Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So this is the 9th anniversary of the podcast today, and the date didn't exactly sneak up on me or anything, but for the last couple of weeks I've been considering this episode, and honestly I haven't known what to do with it. So when the time came down to having to finally decide what we were going to do here, I naturally got reflective and started thinking about the history of the podcast, and I've shared that on the podcast here before. But there is one part of the story of the podcast and how it got started that I've never really talked about, and it kind of seems ridiculous that that's the case, but I started this podcast, one of the reasons why was just because I wanted to talk about Star Wars. It's not exactly a revolutionary idea, but for my own life it was. Like where I live and the, conditions of my life, I have a really small circle of friends, like really, really small. And none of them want to talk about Star Wars as much as I do, which is fine, of course. I mean, I'm a person who's had a passion for Star Wars burning in his heart for as long as I could remember. And I tried to care about the expanded universe. I really did. And I just, couldn't get my heart into it. So just for the longest time, I felt disconnected from Star Wars until we found out that we were going to get new movies and that Lucasfilm was reconsidering the canon, and we were going to get a new animated show with Star Wars Rebels. This is all, of course, in 2014, and it felt like my fandom fire had been relit again, and it was an astounding, ecstatic feeling, and I just wanted to talk about it. But again, really small circle of friends and vanishingly small interest in Star Wars by comparison. There are other things I like to talk about, but yeah, Star Wars is always something that's running on a separate track in the back of my mind. Of course, it doesn't help that in person, I'm actually kind of socially awkward. And I'm learning in therapy that this may be a byproduct of my upbringing, but it's just something that I've dealt with my whole life. And when I meet new people, I would rather ask them questions about themselves and let them do the talking and, not necessarily offer my own stuff in that regard. So basically, starting a Star Wars podcast was a way for me to start Star Wars conversations with people beyond the small little town and the smaller little circle of friends that I encounter on a daily basis. And now I'm at the point where I've started nearly 3,300 conversations about Star Wars, which is clearly insane. The whole daily podcast aspect of it has to do with the fact that as a listener, I don't necessarily like having to wait for a week, 2 weeks or more for the next episode of my favorite podcast. And B, I don't always have time to listen to long form podcasts. So, you kind of lose the thread of the conversation when you're only listening to bits and bytes at a time. And the fact that when I started this, there weren't very many daily Star Wars podcasts going on, and they're still, again, vanishingly small. So essentially, I tried to create the podcast that I would like listening to on a daily basis, and along the way, found a lot of other folks who liked that kind of thing and who I've started conversations with over the years, which has been a beautiful, blissful thing. Now, I've been doing this for 9 years and I still enjoy the heck out of it. There's a lot that I still love about it, but my own podcast listening habits have changed over the years, and I know yours have too. So I think it's time to start reconsidering what these conversations are that we're having. I'm not exactly sure what that means just yet. I still love doing this daily and want to keep doing that. And I still want to keep talking about new Star Wars stories that come out with you. But if I'm being honest, the list of stories that have been coming out over the years, like the stuff that we haven't talked about, is kind of, piling up. And I feel a bit of a pressure around it, like almost a guilt around it too. We haven't talked about any of the novels that wrapped up Phase 2 of the High Republic, for example, or either of the story modes of the Star Wars Jedi video games. And anything comic book related has really been few and far between. But maybe, just maybe, we don't necessarily have to talk about every Star Wars story. And maybe there are other things that we could be talking about that I haven't yet considered. So as we head into year 10 of this endeavor, let's keep this particular conversation open, this side conversation about what would be awesome for us to be talking about in this podcast. Then I'll get more concrete. I'll start it with a simple question, which is, what is something that you would like to hear about more often on the podcast? Doesn't have to be every week necessarily. Could be once a month, could be, less often or whatever. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that. If you're catching this on YouTube, hey, comments are right there. If you're listening to the audio version, then please head over to the blog post for this show's episode at sw7x7.com. You're looking for episode 3290 and commenting on that post. Meanwhile, whether you've been around for one episode or 10 or 100 or 1,000 or more, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. Thank you so much for your feedback, your praise, your critiques, your insights, your belief, your support, and your love of Star Wars, your giant, enormous, abiding love of Star Wars, so much that you have decided to make this podcast a part of your life. And I'm really looking forward to what we're going to end up building with this 10th year of the podcast. But for now, that is going to do it for this 9th anniversary episode of the show. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always. And may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyrighted by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.